This paper uses fashion blogging to look at conspicuous consumption in digital spaces. The original theory of conspicuous consumption states that people buy goods to display their status and wealth to other people. And I'm interested in two things. First, can we apply this theory to digital spaces? And second, how do the dynamics of fashion blogging demonstrate some of the complications and limitations in the theory of conspicuous consumption? So let's start with what is fashion blogging. It's blogging about fashion. And there are a few known male fashion bloggers, but the majority of fashion bloggers are overwhelmingly women. And we can divide fashion blogs into three broad categories. The first is personal style bloggers who take pictures of themselves and put them online. These here are examples of personal style bloggers. The second are inspiration bloggers who sort of review the runway shows, talk about designer goods. And the third are street style bloggers who post pictures of people they see out and about in their daily lives. And so in this presentation, I'm really focusing on these personal style blogs. Now, fashion blogging is really significant both online and off. First of all, there's thousands of fashion bloggers. There's 3,000 fashion bloggers who are members of the Independent Fashion Blogger Association, and there's probably thousands more who aren't. And they're all over the world. There's fashion blogger meetups in cities from Calgary to Budapest to Perth. Second of all, they're having an increasing influence in mainstream fashion and retail campaigns. So here you can see that there's a Forever 21 campaign with Rumi from Fashion Toast, a Gap campaign with Susie Bubble, who's another well-known fashion blogger. And on the right, we have Coach's entire holiday campaign for last year, which was completely based around fashion blogs and fashion bloggers. So they get free goods in advertising, they get book deals like Jessica Quirk, the What I Wore blog, and they're generally considered to be sort of word-of-mouth marketers and trendsetters. This also mirrors what's going on in the startup world. We see a big push in these digitally mediated consumption communities or social shopping sites. So we have things like group buying sites like Groupon, community shopping sites like Etsy or ModCloth, product review sites like Goodreads, or bookmarking and curation sites like Pinterest and Polyvore. And these are very heavily funded by venture capitalists. It's a very hot area of expansion. Now, when I talk about consumption, what do I mean? And I'm using a definition of consumption that really goes beyond just the buying and selling of goods. And this is a quote from Elizabeth Chin, who wrote a book about consumption. And she really defines consumption as a very broad process that includes activities like fantasizing about a car, making budgets, going to a thrift store, scavenging dumpsters, doing window shopping. And I think that this definition of consumption really has two advantages to it. First of all, it includes people who don't have huge purchasing power, who can't afford to purchase a lot of goods. And second of all, it includes people who are invisible to mainstream advertising and marketing. So when you see an online site like Polyvore, where young girls make collages of goods that they would never be able to afford, that's clearly participating in consumption, but it's not buying and selling. Now, fashion blogs and social shopping sites also fit within this broad definition of consumption. But there's a key difference online, which is sharing and display. So fashion bloggers blog and take pictures of themselves to be displayed to others. Their intent is to have people look at them. And a key part of a site like Polyvore or Caboodle is showing what you buy or what you desire to other people. So perhaps conspicuous consumption can be a useful theory to understand some of these dynamics, given the audience that is intrinsic to blogging and Web 2.0. So this is a project that's in progress. I'm going to be working on it for the next couple of years. So far, I've done about 25, 30 interviews in 4 different cities. I've been to events in 2 different cities. And I've been reading fashion blogs and looking at sort of the discourse around fashion blogging in the mainstream media. So let's go back to the original theory of conspicuous consumption, which was coined by Thorstein Veblen, and he's very much a product of his time, which was Gilded Age, turn of the century New York in 1899. And his original theory talked about consumption as pecuniary display. It was wasteful and excessive, and it demonstrated that the person engaging at it had a lot of free time and a lot of extra money. So, for example, having a big household with a lot of servants, like uniformed footmen, or outfitting your wife and your children in costumes with like excess yards of fabric to sort of show that you could afford to do something like that. But there's a lot of problems with this theory as we know it today. First of all, it's very vague. What do we mean when we say conspicuous? Is the intent on the part of the person who's buying the good to be conspicuous to others, or is it on the part of the person who perceives it? If they see somebody wearing a fur coat, do they think that is impressive or not? We don't really know. That hasn't really been theorized. It also doesn't include non-face-to-face interactions. If you look at the literature on conspicuous consumption, it usually talks about neighbors or fellow men, which completely leaves out the digital, and also doesn't doesn't really take into account the fact that status is deeply influenced by social context, which often means more than just the people who are in close proximity to you on a day-to-day basis. Now, in some ways, fashion bloggers engage with consumption in very traditional ways. They promote the concept of fashion, they promote brands, they display goods, and they serve as an inspiration to their readers to shop. But in other words, they really interrogate and position themselves against mindless buying or selling. And I'm going to briefly go through 3 anecdotes from my interviews to show some examples of ways in which fashion bloggers sort of complicate some of these ideas of consumption. So this is a quote, it's a long quote, from one of my informants, Allie XT, who's this kind of punk rock girl from Boston. And she started her blog because she wanted to spend a year wearing clothes from thrift stores to show people that they could consume fashionably in a sustainable, eco-friendly way. She also sees blogs as a way to counter the negative messaging in TV and magazines. So she says, I consume blogging because it's not traditional media and it allows me to tune out some of the messages I would get on TV. And so what messages are those? And she says, you're bombarded constantly with reaffirmation of some things that blogging goes against, which is you need push-up bras and spandex to look beautiful, you need to lose weight, you need to buy the most expensive, the latest, the made in China goods. You need to stand out but stand in at the same time. So her blog she sees as an intervention into these very mainstream, very consumptive practices of fashion. This quote is from Sami. She's a working class Asian American woman from Boston, and she grew up very working class and then got sort of inculcated into this high class position by going to an elite liberal arts school and then working in some very high end stores like Louis Vuitton. So she really engages with class in a complex way. She has a real frustration with the fact that the goods that she sells in her stores, she couldn't have afforded growing up. So she says this furniture that she sells is meant to be heirloom pieces. You're meant to pass them down to your children, but poor people can't do that. I get angry. I wish everyone could have that luxury of passing it down to their children. So she uses her blog to sort of talk about some of these issues around class and fashion, which you very rarely see covered in the mainstream fashion press. She also displays Asian American models as sort of another advocacy strategy, and she shows off very fashionable goods that she bought for very cheap. And finally, this is a picture from the blog of Laura and Josh, who are an artistic partnership. They're boyfriend and girlfriend. And all of Laura's outfits are vintage, and all of her photographs are about sort of placing the body within a setting and trying to evoke a feeling from the viewer. I think that Laura would say that she sees herself very much in the tradition of feminist self-portraiture artists like Nan Goldin and Cindy Sherman. And she's really doing this from more of a very sort of aesthetic, artistic perspective than just buying or selling goods. So I think that these 3 examples show that fashion bloggers are not engaging in quote-unquote mindless consumption, and instead they're able to work out some of their issues with fashion that they wouldn't necessarily read about or view anywhere else. And they allow themselves to sort of engage in clothing and fashion in a fun and playful way without having to necessarily engage in mainstream retail or the fashion press. But there's a few key differences that have to do with the visual display of blogging specifically and the assumption of an audience. And a lot of these fall under the rubric of authenticity. So you'll notice in Allie's quote, she was comparing blogs to traditional magazines. And this is because, as David Grazian says, authenticity is always manufactured in contradistinction to something else. So blogs are authentic, magazines are not. And there's 3 reasons why bloggers think this is so. The first is because people who are famous online are said to be more accessible or more authentic than people who are famous offline. They respond to their readers, they interact with their commenters, things like that. Secondly, bloggers put a big emphasis on the fact that they're showing the bodies of real women rather than models. There's a definite feminist sense of fat positivity in a lot of these blogs. And third, the idea that personal style is an individual, artistic, authentic expression of self. So what is high status in the blogging community is not just an expensive good like Veblen theorized. Instead, to impress people, a blogger has to be authentically stylish and maintain her integrity in a way that's different from the mainstream fashion press. So what are some of the implications of all this for theories of conspicuous consumption? Well, first, I think it really does show this idea of consumption as a broad social practice as valid. There's a lot of ways to engage in this consumption without buying clothes. And bloggers really do think through their consumption in these very nuanced and complex ways, and often ways that are counter to the dominant fashion industry. Second, bloggers are conspicuous. They display themselves. They photograph their outfits for a networked audience, and their intent is to be seen. And I think that this could be sort of a methodological way to get at some of the problems with the vagueness of conspicuous consumption. If we know that the intent of the blogger is to be photographed and to be displayed, maybe this problem could be worked out, looking at some of those kind of the technical affordances of the software that they use, or something like that. And finally, I think it's very interesting to think through what counts as conspicuous or impressive to whether it's a global or a local sort of influencer base. So fashion blogging is a subculture. So a lot of the time, fashion bloggers are dressing to impress other fashion bloggers who aren't necessarily co-located anywhere near them. But at the same time, it's a very global set of people who might be all over the world. So I think the conspicuousness can definitely be used for the non-local, as long as status in the world where status structures are networked rather than geographically bound, which is definitely the world of Web 2.0 and social media. So I'm working on expanding this paper, especially the sort of ideas of authenticity and display, and I would always appreciate feedback. Thank you.